Hi, my name is Martin Nelson, and for the next 30 minutes or so, I will attempt to deliver a class entitled A Definitive Defense for Creation from a New Testament Perspective, a case against theistic evolution. This class covers a few rather challenging theories, but we'll attempt to work through it. In John 8:32, Jesus Christ said, quote, "And you shall know reality, and reality shall set you free." This presentation topic concerns a corner of reality. This class is in a 5-point outline. It begins with some housekeeping discussion, introductory matters. The next point, step 2, is a brief introduction to the Krebs cycle. The following point, step 3, is a talk of what is meant by theistic evolution. And the remaining concern, step 4, is a very concise conversation of New Testament Greek verb tenses. This step, that is step 4, includes a detailed appreciation of the New Testament verbs for the Old Testament creation story. The fourth point also places the issues of the Krebs cycle with those of the third point to see if macroevolution is a possible explanation for the reality of creation. The last point is, of course, the overview and conclusion. With the topic of a definitive defense for creation, as in any discussion, the terminology is an obstacle to overcome. Communication can be difficult because it is necessary to provide an ultimate definition for the vocabulary used. A simple example used within this class is the German term Aktienchart. Walke and O'Connor, a couple of Old Testament Hebrew scholars, define it one way, and A.T. Robertson, a New Testament Greek scholar, communicates a different definition. Some definitions are based on each one's bias and unique reality. History is fraught with believing and non-believing philosophers, apologists, and even laymen who have their own reality and their own explanation for it, their own unique individual epistemology. Schaeffer provides a listing of some of the numerous available epistemologies: rationalism, empiricism, agnosticism, idealism, positivism, existentialism, and mysticism. Furthermore, according to Francis Schaeffer, how a person perceives their reality must be understood by the individual, and for it to be a real, that is, quote, propositional, true, unquote, reality, it must be in the realm of something that can be communicated. This communication must be either rational, which is a prerequisite for communication, or demonstrable, that is, empirical. Of the various available epistemologies, two of the three epistemologies used within this presentation are rationalism and empiricism. Sometimes philosophers place these two perceptions into a conflicting parallel. Descartes pursued pure knowledge, and Hume et al. Countered by using senses as the foundation for knowledge. The New Dictionary of Theology says, quote, rationalism and empiricism are attempts to cure doubt, unquote. The third epistemology used by this author is faith. Because the non-believing world viewpoint consistently kicks at it as even a part of reality, faith, as a system of perception for epistemology, has gradually lost its ability to prove reality. Unlike the current Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, who refuse to define faith other than religious, as the quote on this slide, 20 years ago, the Routledge Encyclopedia of Philosophy mentioned that faith was a possible system of perception. However, a Google search reveals that faith, as a third epistemology, is a valid base of perception primarily to the religious community and philosophers. But the consistent destruction of faith as a basis of truth, truths that make up society and the Christian viewpoint foundational truths, are destroying much of our epistemology base for reality. The links shown on this slide are a few of the various organizations from the Google search. As the non-Christian world viewpoint destroys Christian foundations, that is, the removal of the true God from faith and the complete eradication of God from science, there is no longer a foundation for science, no logic, no consistency, no repeatability. Instead, science erodes to no empiricism nor rationalism and becomes irrational and non-pragmatic, as Hawkins states in this slide. Consequently, the scientific method is now somewhat ambiguous. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy includes two positions for the scientific method: the old deferentialist position and the new syntax position. The new syntax, quote, position is that science has no epistemic authority and no uniquely rational method and is merely just politics. The old deferentialist position is that of the traditional scientific method of making guesses about the universals, then observing and experimenting with the particulates to prove the universals. Staten states that, quote, the scientific method is not an algorithm, unquote, but a system of both deductive and inductive reasoning to test hypotheses. Moving from introduction to class, the step between organic, that is living, and inorganic, that is non-living, can seem tiny, but really is quite colossal. One of the mechanisms involved in this colossal step is a small structure within the cell, an organelle, called mitochondria. The mitochondria generates energy by a system known as the Krebs cycle. The sister to the mitochondria is the chloroplast, which is the normal plant photosynthesis organelle. Several individuals over several years were involved in discovering the Krebs cycle. However, it is named after Sir Hans Otto Krebs, who asserted this cycle existed in 1937, for which he won the Nobel Prize for Medicine. On this slide is an illustration of the Krebs cycle. Lane, in his book Transformer: The Deep Chemistry of Life, explains the Krebs cycle as a semi-truck going through a roundabout. As the semi-truck enters the roundabout, the blue arrows in the figure, a trailer is attached to it. As the semi-truck proceeds through the roundabout, the trailer is removed and taken elsewhere. Finally, the truck gets all the way around the roundabout, and as the truck is about to re-enter, the byproduct from the previous trip is the trailer, which is once again attached to the semi-truck. Colored in yellow on this side, the semi-truck, in Lane's description, the molecule ISCA, begins at the top of the roundabout. As it enters, it gets the trailer oxaloacetate. As Lane's truck goes around the roundabout and the molecules drop carbon atoms, the molecule is changed. Thus the new names: citrate with 6 carbon atoms. The 5 carbon atom is called isoctate, not named in this slide. 4 carbon atom is called succinate, also not named on this slide. And finally, oxaloacetate. The figure is very, very simplistic for a rather complex chemical interchange, and most of what occurs is not in the graphic. The Krebs cycle is just one of a multitude of particulates that support the universal scientific formula that states, simplistically, oxygen and hydrogen prefer to dance together. Water, by using direct current, can be separated into hydrogen and oxygen. When these two chemicals are put back together with a spark of energy, there is an explosion. Some car manufacturers use this method to drive their cars, i.e. Honda FCX and Toyota Mirai. Therefore, the Krebs cycle has been validated both with rationalism, explained, and empiricism, demonstrated, and epistemologically accepted to be part of this reality. Some interesting macroevolution facts can be developed if the Krebs cycle is placed into a XY plane of reality, the R plane. This has been done in this slide. In this slide, the XY plane is the reality plane, the R plane, while the XZ plane is the plane from front to back. This could best be illustrated by the next slide where, excuse me, where the XY plane, the R plane, is rotated B minus 45 degrees. This slide might appear somewhat fuzzy, but with the XY plane at this angle, b minus 45 degrees, the difficulties with macroevolution appear. By copying the reality plane onto the z-axis at z minus 1, there appears another Krebs cycle, the pre-Krebs cycle to the current reality Krebs cycle. If the rotation of the x-axis is continued until b minus 90 degrees is achieved, the z-axis becomes observable. This can be seen here in this figure. Also, in this figure, the z-axis is entitled evolution iterations. These evolution iterations are the iterations of natural selection and labeled reality minus 1, r minus 1, r minus 2, r minus 3, and r minus n. Since each natural selection iteration demands a viable, living, and existing entity, the pre-Krebs cycle at iteration reality minus 1 or r minus 1 must be successful. Half of a Krebs cycle is of zero use. It would not survive for a natural selection iteration. The pre-Krebs cycle at iteration reality minus 2 or r minus 2 must also be successful. The pre-Krebs cycle at iteration r minus 3 must also be successful. This must hold true for all historical natural selection iterations of the Krebs cycle until r minus 1, when there is zero Krebs cycle with no respiration. Furthermore, as this reality is just a placeholder for the evolution iterations continuum, the post-Krebs cycle at iteration r plus 1 must be successful. This is true of all iterations of natural selection through r plus 1 to r plus n, where entropy causes the free energy of this universe to drop to zero. This is a far more than gargantuan task for evolution espousers. The pre-Krebs cycle at iteration r minus 1 has never been explained, rationalism, nor demonstrated, empiricism, and thus must be based on the third system of perception, faith. Using the equation r plus n minus r minus n equals delta r, then no iterations except the current r have been explained, rationalism, nor demonstrated, empiricism, and thus must be based on faith. And as seen above, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy states that such a system of perception is religious. Just in the reality plane of life chemistry, the evolution espouser's task is massive. Explaining or demonstrating the delta R of photosynthesis to respiration. Explaining or demonstrating the delta R of asexual reproduction to sexual reproduction. Explaining or demonstrating the delta R of ectotherms, i.e. dinosaurs or reptiles which get their body heat from the environment, to endotherms, i.e. birds and mammals which maintain body heat internally, etc. If the Krebs cycle of these Cartesian illustrations above is replaced with something larger, i.e., the universe of this reality, the colossal task for evolution espousers becomes indescribable. The microevolution espouser's task involves or demonstrating the delta R of all physical aspects of this reality, and also all non-physical aspects of this reality. The delta R of the excluded middle, the delta R of love, faith, hope, the delta R of rationalism, empiricism, logic, thoughts, dreams, etc. Lacking rationalism and empirical data, it is safe to conclude that macroevolution does not exist in this reality, and it is a faith-based espoused system. Evolution, whether macroevolution or microevolution, has crept into our lives, mainly because Darwinian evolutionary theory became a social ideology. Darwinian evolution has affected society's thinking about hefty things like war and abortion. If it is accepted that macroevolution is a faith-based espoused system, then it is accepted that Darwin's book on the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life, is the Bible for macroevolutionary thought. Furthermore, even though a reading of the book does not suggest race theory, the very title of the book suggests that it is concerned with race theory, and it has been used as such. Myers, in Theistic Evolution, gives at least three separate variations of theistic evolution. Theistic evolution appears to be a continuum of evolutionary beliefs from microevolution through macroevolution with extremes on both sides. Most Christians understand that if they catch COVID-19, the immune system will automatically manufacture defense items against it, which few Christians would deny. These Christians would be labeled with the microevolution tag. However, some Christians became frightened of COVID-19, thinking it was a natural selection iteration when they, like many others, believe, quote, newly evolved coronaviruses pose a high threat to global public health, unquote. These Christians, losing faith in their God, get labeled at that point with macroevolution. As most Christians are some form of microevolutionist, the problem is not the theme of theistic evolution. The problem is that the plot involves syncretism. It is the mixing of the, for a lack of a better term, religion of Christianity with the religion of macroevolution. These two religions are different. Christianity is a religion of love, while macroevolution is a religion of hate. Christianity, peace. Macroevolution, war. Christianity, life. Macroevolution, death. Macroevolution is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, while Christianity is caring for your neighbor. The uncontrollable difficulty arises when Christians set down parts of true dogma alongside the superfluous dogma of the evolution iterations continuum. These Christians have manufactured a syncretism belief system based upon nothing but their own personal bias and unique reality. Theistic macroevolution, in this sense, is a personal worldview. Therefore, according to Paul in Romans 12:1 and 2, the only defense for this personal theistic macroevolution is on their moment by moment individual decision. The New Testament Greek, Koine Greek, is not English, Hebrew, nor Latin. This is especially true while translating the Koine Greek verb. Robertson's grammar discusses verb tenses from page 821 through page 910. Herein is a very short overview of this topic. Furthermore, Robertson has only one grammar. There are many others. The Koine Greek was used for a relatively short time. The pre-New Testament Greek, i.e. Homer, and the post-New Testament Greek both lacked and contained various components which differentiated them from New Testament Greek. Not to say that New Testament Greek was a special and unique language, but it is like English, which differs from Old and Middle English. One major distinctiveness of the Koine Greek is the use of kind of action over the concept of time of action. Robertson, while quoting Giles, states, quote, "We must be careful to observe that tenses, i.e. past, present, future, in the sense in which the word is now used, are of comparatively late development," unquote. By tense, Robertson et al. Mean past, present, future. However, the kind of action, which Robertson refers to as action sart, is also of three possible types: punctiliar, derlative, and perfected state. According to Robertson, the action sart of the New Testament Greek verb is derived from two elements of that verb. One, its root stem, and two, its grammatical form. Robertson states on page 822, quote, "There were originally two verb types, stems, the one denoting derlative or linear action, the other momentary or punctiliar action. Hence, some verbs have two roots, stems, one linear, derlative, the other punctiliar, momentary." Even though there's more than one way of dialogue, and there can be some overlapping between tenses in translating. According to Weiner, strictly and properly speaking, no one of these tenses can ever stand for another, unquote. Robertson stated it, quote, the aorist is not used instead of the imperfect, but the aorist is often used in the midst of imperfects, unquote. The eventual questions then are what tense the New Testament writers preferred when examining the creation events in Genesis 1. When dealing with the Old Testament creation story, are most New Testament Greek verbs punctiliar, that is aorist tense, or iterative, that is imperfect? An iterative imperfect tense style would certainly provide grounds for accepting macroevolution's iterations, thereby ensuring theistic evolution syncretism. An aorist tense, however, would be contrary to iterations, because aorist is a dot in time, a punctiliar event. Plutarch, a prolific writer born 46 AD and died after 110 AD, and whose writings make up 14 volumes in the Loeb Classical Library, wrote at the same time the Greek New Testament was created. Thus, Plutarch should share Koine Greek with the New Testament writers. A search of Greek words is possible within the Loeb Classical Library. The search is an exact match search, as it will only find exactly what is typed. No wildcard searches nor lemmas, that is word stems, searches exist within the Loeb Classical Library. This table is the result of a search of Plutarch for the Koine Greek word create. The search was conducted for the Greek word for create and only the word in the imperfect tense, third person, singular was sought. Therefore, all these references are imperfect tense, and it appears that each reference would require an imperfect tense, opposed to an aorist tense. The references reflect that it is iterative, reference number 1, to establish the Babylonian Empire. Reference number 2, cities he built up. And reference number 3, he built the city. All three references require the idea of an ongoing iterative action and would imply the idea of kept on establishing or kept on building. This search confirms that the imperfect tense of the verb create existed for the New Testament writer's use. No other searches of the Loeb Classical Library were done. The BibleWorks program can search the Bible using wildcard and lemma, that is word stem searches. Unlike the Loeb Classical Library, This search returns all references regardless of the tense of the verb. A parallel search of the Greek New Testament for the word create shows that the New Testament writers are quite clear that creation was not iterative, but punctiliar. This search is an exhaustive search and includes all references of the verb create in the Nestle Allen 28th edition Greek New Testament. 15 references were located, and of the 15 references found in the search, 14 are punctiliar aorist tense. It is confusing that at reference number 1, for some reason the translators determined to use the word made in place of created. Not all 14 references discuss original creation. References 5, 6, 8, and 11 on the last slide probably do not refer to original creation. Of those references that probably infer original creation, references 1, 3, 7 are aorist participles, and the translation should possibly be more like Romans 1:25, reference 3, and translated as creator. The only non-aorist tense is reference 10. When Colossians 1:16 says, quote, "For by him all things were created," unquote, Paul used a perfect tense, which Robertson declares as a, quote, "perfected state," unquote. There are no iterative states of creation found in the New Testament verbal creation opinion. Just a small side note to think about. The Greek Old Testament, the LXX or Septuagint, is sometimes a poor translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. Even though this search states that 35 of the 54 uses of create in the Greek Old Testament are aorist, and thus supports the New Testament search, this information is non-conclusive. During this class, these items were discussed. It began with some housekeeping discussion, introductory matters. The second point was a brief introduction to the Krebs cycle and its evolutionary iterations. The third point was a discussion of what is meant as theistic evolution, and the fourth point was a concise overview of New Testament Greek verb tenses, with a detailed understanding of the New Testament verbs for the Old Testament creation story. This last point is the conclusion. It has been seen macroevolution and the delusional foundation upon which it stands demands an iterative process. An iterative process which enables natural selection's implementation and design to create this present reality in small, even tiny, steps. Furthermore, this present reality involves a great deal more than mere complex chemical changes, as in the Krebs cycle. It also involves abstracts, inspirations, and beliefs. Those believers who proclaim that God used time plus chance and bring about a new syncretistic theistic evolutionary belief are in direct conflict with plenary verbal inspiration. The Greek New Testament states emphatically that creation of this reality was punctiliar, not iterative. The dance of hydrogen and oxygen, the excluded middle, love, faith, hope, irrationalism, empiricism, logic, thoughts, dreams, etc., were all there instantaneously at creation. This is reference slide 1. Reference slide 2. Reference slide 3. Reference slide 4. Slide 5. Reference slide 6. References slide 7. References slide 8. Are there any questions or comments? Thanks for listening.